What does it mean when something powerful vanishes? History is full of loud moments, trumpets, banners, victories carved into stone. But sometimes the most haunting stories are the quiet ones, the forces that appeared briefly, changed everything, and then slipped away as if the world agreed not to speak of them again. Across centuries, certain armies and elite units emerged like sudden storms. They weren't just strong, they were strangely advanced, organized beyond their era, disciplined in ways their societies shouldn't have been able to sustain. They moved with precision, fought with cohesion, and left witnesses shaken. And then they disappeared. No manuals passed down, no direct successors, no lasting blueprint. Only fragments, a battlefield grave, a carved inscription, a historian's uneasy paragraph. This is not a story about monsters or myths. It is a story about people, about the rare moments when human beings unlocked something extraordinary in warfare, loyalty, and collective discipline, and then lost it. Our journey begins in ancient Greece, inside a walled city where an idea took shape that still challenges what we think we know about combat. An army built not on bloodline or wealth, but on devotion. 300 men, paired in intimate bonds, training not for conquest, but for each other. They were called the Sacred Band, and for a moment they made the invincible tremble. What happens when love becomes strategy? And what does it mean when history chooses silence instead of remembrance? Let's step back into the dust of the 4th century before the Common Era, where the first of these disappearing armies begins to march. What if the strongest weapon on a battlefield wasn't steel, but loyalty? In the year 378 BCE, the Greek world was restless. City-states watched one another like rival constellations, each shining with ambition, each threatened by collapse. Sparta stood above them all, disciplined, feared, seemingly permanent. And then, in Thebes, something unexpected began to form. Not a new army in the usual sense, a new idea. 300 men, chosen carefully, trained constantly, arranged not by rank but by pairs, 150 bonds that were personal, intimate, unbreakable. They were not brothers by blood. They were partners by choice. The Sacred Band of Thebes was built on a radical belief that a soldier would fight hardest not for glory or payment, but to protect the person standing beside him. That love, in its deepest form, could become discipline. That affection could become armor. In an age where masculinity was measured through domination, this unit introduced something almost unthinkable: emotional connection as military structure. They trained year-round, even in peacetime. While other hoplites returned to farms and workshops, the Sacred Band drilled like a modern professional force. Their movements became synchronized. Their trust became instinct. Ancient historians would later describe them with awe, noting how they pivoted as one body, how their formation held even on uneven ground. And then came Leuctra, 371 BCE, a battlefield where Sparta expected another routine victory. The Spartan right wing, the pride of Greece, advanced with the confidence of tradition. They had never truly been broken. Their reputation alone often ended battles before they began, but Thebes did not meet them with symmetry. General Epaminondas arranged his forces in an oblique formation, concentrating strength where it mattered most. At the core stood the Sacred Band, not as decoration, but as the spear point. When the clash came, it was not chaos, it was precision. The Sacred Band pressed forward with terrifying cohesion, pushing into the Spartan elite. Shield met shield, breath met breath. And slowly, unbelievably, the Spartan line began to bend. Then it broke. That day, Spartan dominance ended. The shock rippled across Greece like an earthquake. It wasn't only a military upset, it was a philosophical one. The world had witnessed an anomaly, a unit whose power came from intimacy, not hierarchy. And yet, even as their legend grew, something strange happened. Their memory did not expand into empire, it narrowed into silence. Decades later, Macedon rose. Philip II sought to consolidate Greece under a new order. At Chaeronea, in 338 BCE, the Sacred Band made its final stand. They did not retreat. They fought until every man fell. 300 bodies buried side by side. Philip himself, it is said, walked among them with sorrow rather than triumph. And then the world moved on. No grand doctrine replicated them. No empire rebuilt their model. Their story became a whisper. Why? Perhaps because they revealed something unsettling, that the deepest strength in war is not always technology or numbers, but human attachment. And perhaps that is also why they could not be allowed to endure. If love could overturn Sparta, what else could it overturn? The Sacred Band remains a ghost in the military imagination, proof that once, briefly, devotion marched in formation, and then vanished into time. What if an army never seemed to die? In the shadowed passes of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, Greek scouts saw something they could not explain. 10,000 soldiers moving as one, silent, gleaming, unchanging. They carried spears that caught the sun like polished glass. Their robes shimmered. Their boots struck the earth in rhythm. Not hurried, not hesitant. And always, there were 10,000. Never more, never less. The Greeks called them the Immortals. This elite force served the Achaemenid kings of Persia, from Cyrus the Great through to Darius III. They were not myth, they were not legend, they were real, and they were terrifying. Whenever a man fell in battle, another appeared in his place. The number, 10,000, never broke. It was said that replacements were immediate, as if each man was merely a shadow of the next. The illusion was seamless, an army that could not be diminished. But this wasn't just a trick of numbers. The Immortals were crafted with care. They carried composite bows that could punch through armor, spears with iron tips, shields made from layered wicker, light, durable, shock-absorbent. Some wore scale armor under their tunics, glinting like fish in the sun. Bronze, iron, even gilded plating. More than elite bodyguards, they were a rapid response force, capable of fighting in mountains, deserts, cities. They moved with their own supply chains, their own engineers, their own embedded logistics. In form and function, they resembled something closer to a modern division than an ancient army. But here is where the trail begins to blur. Despite their power, no Persian manual survives, no detailed scroll of their tactics. Most of what we know comes through the eyes of others, Greek writers, enemy scouts, second-hand accounts. Their barracks, never found. Their records, silent. Even among themselves, it is said, the true identities of replacements were hidden. Men were trained in secret, rotated in silence. Their command structure was opaque, their funding sources unclear. Some historians suggest they were more than just soldiers, perhaps the expression of a philosophy or a political necessity too complex for open governance. And then, as with all things in this story, they disappeared. When Alexander the Great defeated the Persian Empire, The immortals did not reappear under any successor state. No empire continued their lineage. Their model, so effective, so precise, was simply not used again. No one knows why. There were no obvious weaknesses, no scandalous betrayals, just a vanishing. Perhaps they belonged to a system too carefully engineered, one that could not survive without its original architecture. Or perhaps they were erased because their existence raised uncomfortable questions. What happens when an army is not bound by tribe or fame or recognition? Or what happens when soldiers are made interchangeable, yet utterly elite? To this day, they challenge our understanding of ancient warfare, not just for their capabilities, but for what they suggest, that an empire once built a military force far ahead of its time, and then allowed it, or needed it, to be forgotten. Because some strategies are not meant to be shared. Some weapons are silence itself. What if armor could think? In 52 BCE, during the siege of Alesia, the Gallic tribes witnessed something they could not explain. From the horizon emerged Roman cohorts, not in disarray, not with shouts or scattered lines, but in silent, unified motion. It looked like a creature, not a column of men. A dome of shields, moving forward with unstoppable purpose. Arrows bounced off, rocks struck and slid, javelins shattered harmlessly. The defenders watched as the formation advanced, shield upon shield, layer upon layer, until it pressed against their very walls. It was called the testudo, Latin for tortoise, and it did not blink. The testudo formation was more than protection. It was performance, a show of discipline so refined that even chaos could not penetrate it. Soldiers in front held their shields forward. Those on the sides angled theirs outward. The rear sealed the back, and overhead, layers of rectangular shields locked together like tiles on a roof. From above, they looked like an armored machine. From the side, like a fortress in motion. It required no magic, just impossible precision. One man misaligned, and the formation failed. One soldier panicked, and the illusion of invincibility crumbled. And yet, again and again, it worked. Under fire, on muddy ground, uphill, even crossing rivers. This was not brute strength, it was calculation, engineering. Roman commanders didn't just train soldiers, they programmed them. Today, military historians still marvel. How did men weighed down with armor, weapons, and equipment, many illiterate, drawn from distant provinces, move in such unison? How did they maintain geometric spacing under siege? Some suggest pre-calculated formations based on shield dimensions. Others believe it required mathematical drills practiced for months. But here's the riddle. The testudo disappears with Rome. The Western Empire fell. The tactic did not evolve. It vanished. No medieval army, not during the Crusades or the 100 Years' War, ever recreated it. Not even the disciplined ranks of Byzantium replicated the tortoise. The age of chivalry brought knights and castles, but never this mobile wall of men. Why? Some say it was too rigid for the fragmented, chaotic battles of the Middle Ages. Others point to the collapse of Roman logistics. Without Rome's system of supply, training, and discipline, the formation simply couldn't survive. But a more unsettling theory lingers, that the testudo wasn't just a tactic, it was the result of an entire worldview, a military-industrial complex centuries ahead of its time, that treated humans as components of a larger organism. Once that worldview collapsed, the tactic became impossible to replicate. No complete manuals survive, no diagrams, just mosaics, fragmented descriptions, and stunned enemy accounts. It's as if Rome meant for the testudo to be witnessed, not learned. An act of military theatre that declared, "We are not many, we are one." And then, like a play that ends too perfectly, the curtain fell. The tortoise, so slow yet unstoppable, so ancient yet mechanical, left no offspring in the lineage of war. A tactical masterpiece that walked off the stage of history and into mystery. What if war once echoed with the rhythm of machines? In 202 BCE, on the battlefields of ancient China, a strange sound rippled across the valley. Not the clash of swords or the roar of horses, but a mechanical thrum. Fast, measured, relentless. It wasn't drums. It was the sound of crossbows, thousands of them, fired in synchronized waves. Enemy soldiers collapsed before they ever reached blade distance. An entire generation of warfare erased before it could arrive. This was the height of the Han dynasty and the reign of the repeating crossbow corps. While the West still relied on swords, spears, and scattered archery, the Han Empire had engineered something more complex, an infantry built not on strength alone, but on precision, standardization, and timed lethality. The Han crossbows weren't toys, they were marvels. Some had mechanical trigger assemblies with adjustable tension. Others were repeaters, early semi-automatic weapons, operated with a lever that reloaded and fired bolts in rapid succession. Constructed from wood, bronze, sinew, and lacquered parts, these weapons could shoot with deadly force at ranges over 250 feet. Even more astonishing, many were built with interchangeable components, a concept not fully realized in the West until the modern industrial age. In field tests today, replicas still function, still pierce shields, still hit targets with stunning accuracy, and they didn't fight alone. Han crossbowmen operated in structured platoons, shielded, flanked, and supported by engineers who could repair weapons on the move. They carried coordinated quivers, fire arrows, and signaling tools. Sometimes they rode into battle on carts, using mobile platforms for elevated fire. It was an army within an army, a mechanical organism, orchestrated to disrupt everything in its path. But here is where the silence begins. We have their weapons, we have their remains, but we don't have the full instructions. No complete military manual from the Han survives. What we know comes from buried relics, scattered tomb writings, and confused reports from those who saw them in action and lived to describe it. And soon, even those voices faded. Later dynasties, the Tang, the Song, used crossbows, yes, but not like this. Not as an industrialized combat system, not as the core of a modernized military doctrine. The Han model was abandoned. Some say it was too costly. Others whisper that it was too powerful, a system that, if replicated, could turn against its masters. Better to forget than to fear. Today, their weapons sit behind museum glass, sterile and misunderstood. But once, they sang. Once, they fired in harmony, an ancient prelude to modern warfare. And then, like a song never recorded, they were gone. If the Han truly cracked the formula for mass-produced, synchronized killing in the ancient world, then what else have we forgotten? What innovations were not lost by accident, but buried on purpose? In the hush between the bolts, that question still lingers. What happens when outsiders become the guardians of empire? In 988 CE, inside the echoing marble halls of Constantinople's great palace, they marched, not in step with the empire's native legions, but with a rhythm all their own. Towering figures draped in bear and wolf pelts, pale-skinned, axe-wielding, silent. They weren't Roman, they weren't Greek, they were Vikings, and they were the emperor's personal guard. The Varangian Guard. This unit shouldn't have existed. By every rule of ethnicity, politics, and religion, it was impossible. Yet for over 300 years, the most powerful man in Byzantium placed his life in the hands of Norse mercenaries, foreign, pagan-born, and fiercely loyal. Their origin was a deal struck in desperation. Emperor Basil II needed soldiers, not just any, but incorruptible ones. Prince Vladimir of Kievan Rus' sent 6,000 battle-hardened warriors, men who had fought across England, Ireland, and Frankish lands. In return, he received marriage into imperial blood and the Christian faith. But the warriors who came south did not vanish into the empire. They became its elite. The Varangians trained in close protection, urban suppression, and shield wall combat. Their weapon of choice, the rhomphaya, a long-handled axe said to split armor and horse in a single stroke. They answered to no noble house, swore loyalty only to the emperor, and lived apart, isolated in fortified barracks, untouched by the political rot of court intrigue. Even stranger, they were allowed to remain Varangians. They kept their language, their rituals, even traces of their old gods hidden behind the cross. In a world where loyalty was bought and sold, the Varangians were known for refusing bribes. Their incorruptibility became legend. When emperors feared betrayal from within, they turned to these foreign giants for truth. And yet, despite their prominence, they leave behind almost nothing. No manuals, no blueprints, only runes carved into church stones, battle accounts told in awe, and whispers of men who never looked quite like they belonged, because they didn't, but they endured. For centuries, the Varangians stood watch through palace coups, invasions, crusades. They fought in Sicily, Anatolia, and the Balkans, always at the emperor's side, always a paradox, until they weren't. By the 14th century, the rise of gunpowder and shifting alliances made them obsolete. The empire faded. So did the Guard. No force since has replicated their model. Foreign elite warriors, deeply embedded, bound not by culture or blood, but by singular allegiance to a sovereign. Why? Perhaps the trust they embodied is too rare or too dangerous. Because the Varangians were more than bodyguards. They were a mirror, held up to power, reminding emperors that sometimes loyalty comes not from within, but from beyond the walls. And when that mirror cracked, no one dared to piece it back together. They vanished as they came, quietly. But their footsteps still echo in the stones of Constantinople, a reminder that some of the strongest protectors begin as strangers. And some of the most haunting questions begin with trust. What if captives became kings? In 1260, the Mongol advance seemed unstoppable. Cities burned, armies crumbled. Resistance felt like delay, not defiance. Then came the Battle of Ain Jalut. In the heat of the Levant, for the first time, the Mongol horde met a force that didn't flee, a wall of cavalry that struck back with terrifying precision. Their riders weren't nobles, they weren't even free men, not originally. They were the Mamluks, slave soldiers, bought young, torn from homes in the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Balkans, converted, disciplined, sealed into barracks where childhood ended and training began. They weren't just taught to fight, they were molded. From adolescence, Mamluks mastered the arts of mounted warfare. Archery, from horseback, swordplay in formation, battlefield feints, and flanking maneuvers. They didn't merely survive the brutality of their upbringing, they turned it into strength. Their armor was layered, chain, lamella, leather, flexible but formidable. Their composite bows could pierce at 300 feet, even at full gallop. Their communication was precise: horn signals, flags, orchestrated strikes. They studied their enemies, mimicked their tactics, and often improved upon them. At Ain Jalut, they used the Mongols' own strategy: a feigned retreat, a hidden ambush, a brutal counterstrike in narrow terrain. When the dust settled, the Mongols had lost their first major open-field battle. The message was clear: the unstoppable had been stopped. But this was no fluke. The Mamluks would go on to defeat multiple Mongol incursions, and then they did something even more astonishing. They took over. From slaves, they became rulers. After overthrowing their own masters, the Mamluks established a sultanate. They governed Egypt and the Levant for over 250 years, building schools, mosques, libraries, while keeping their military caste intact. But they did not pass power to their sons. By design, every new Mamluk generation was born outside the system. Recruited, imported, retrained, a closed loop, warrior by design, not by birth. No dynasty, no bloodline. A manufactured elite, repeatedly, reliably. How? That remains the puzzle. Few detailed manuals survive. Training was oral, encrypted in ritual. What exists are fragments, obscure treatises, lost scrolls, foreign observers trying to describe the unexplainable. Because the Mamluks weren't just skilled fighters, they were a system. One that made the brutal efficient, that turned captivity into cohesion. And when the gunpowder age finally swept across the region, their cavalry faded, not in defeat, but in absorption. The Ottomans took their land. Their model was retired. No modern force has replicated their exact structure. Perhaps because doing so would mean asking a question we're afraid to answer. What kind of civilization builds its strongest defenders from the ranks of the enslaved? And why did those defenders, once free, choose not to free the system? The Mamluks remain one of history's strangest contradictions. Sovereign warriors forged in bondage, proof that strength can grow in the most unlikely soil, and that sometimes the chains are not what bind, but what forge. What if shadows once ruled the battlefield? In 1581, under a moonless sky, Oda Nobunaga unleashed 40,000 troops upon the mountainous province of Iga. The mission was simple: crush resistance, erase defiance. But what followed defied logic. Messengers vanished mid-route, fires ignited from within secure camps, supplies disappeared, soldiers stumbled into traps that no map recorded. The enemy seemed to know every move before it happened, and no one saw them coming. They weren't samurai, they weren't mercenaries, they were ninja, operatives from the hidden clans of Iga and Koga. Today, their name evokes fantasy: shuriken, black robes, vanishing acts. But the truth is stranger than fiction. The ninja were real, and they were terrifyingly effective. Born in regions excluded from central power, these clans developed an alternative system of warfare, one based on intelligence, sabotage, and stealth. Raised from childhood in secrecy, ninja operatives were trained in lockpicking, disguise, poisons, silent movement, misdirection, and psychological warfare. They memorized terrain, dialects, moon cycles. They practiced scaling walls, simulating footsteps, faking identities. Their manuals, the Bansen Shukai, the Shoninki, read like blueprints for modern covert operations, blueprints centuries ahead of their time. But their greatest strength wasn't in tools or techniques. It was in structure. They operated in cells, each with distinct roles: infiltrators, couriers, saboteurs, decoys. Their missions were planned with precision. their communications encrypted in gesture and symbol. To a samurai, honor was face-to-face combat. To a ninja, victory meant never being seen at all. When Nobunaga's forces finally crushed Iga, the ninja infrastructure dissolved, but didn't die. Some operatives fled. Others were absorbed into rival clans, especially the Tokugawa shogunate, which later used them for internal surveillance. And then they disappeared from record, deliberately. The Tokugawa regime suppressed all knowledge of ninja operations. Over time, fact blurred into folklore. Fiction filled the vacuum. Pop culture replaced the truth. What remains today are fragments, manuals written in code, battlefield mentions in passing, a few artifacts unearthed from forgotten hideouts. But no complete doctrine, no surviving command. The real ninja left no selfies, no signatures, only results. Their tactics, rooted in fear, deception, and disinformation, align more with 21st century intelligence agencies than with any known pre-modern army, and that's what makes them so unsettling. They didn't fight against the rules of their age. They created new rules and made the old ones irrelevant. Honor, chivalry, formation. These were illusions to exploit. The ninja exposed the vulnerability at the heart of tradition, predictability, and they did it with nothing but silence, smoke, and strategy. Had they survived openly, had their methods spread, it's possible modern espionage would trace its roots not to Cold War capitals, but to forested Japanese villages. Perhaps, in some secret way, it already does. The question isn't whether the ninja existed, it's why their truth had to be buried beneath myth, and whether, somewhere in the quiet folds of history, they still move among us, unseen, unknown, and undefeated. What if soldiers were sculpted from silence? In 1453, as Ottoman cannons pounded the walls of Constantinople, defenders reported something odd amid the chaos, a rhythm beneath the noise. Boots, unified, controlled. They weren't irregular troops. They were the Janissaries, clad in distinct uniforms, calm in formation, a force apart from the chaos around them. The Janissary Corps was the backbone of Ottoman expansion, an elite infantry unlike anything Europe or the Islamic world had seen. But they were not born to this role. They were taken. Through a system known as devshirme, Christian boys from conquered Balkan villages were seized, converted, and reconditioned, not broken, but reshaped. They were removed from family, language, and heritage. In their place, a new identity was forged, absolute loyalty to the Sultan. From the age of 7, Janissary recruits were trained in discipline, language, mathematics, music, and most of all, war. They did not marry, did not own land, did not pass on their titles. Their identity was not tribal or ethnic, it was institutional. They became the Sultan's ghost hand, loyal only to him. Their training rivaled modern academies. They mastered firearms centuries before Europe's standing armies. They marched in formation with powder weapons when knights still rode with lances. In siege warfare, they were terrifying. In open battle, unshakable. At Constantinople, they didn't just fight, they executed, breaching walls, holding ground, operating in dense formations with an efficiency that left observers stunned. And yet, they were more than just soldiers. They were a self-contained state, their own hierarchy, their own lodgings, their own internal courts. They were both within the empire and separate from it. This separation was their strength and their danger. Over time, the lines blurred. By the 17th century, Janissaries began claiming political power. They married, bought property, passed ranks to sons, breaking the very structure that had once made them so feared. What had been loyalty became leverage. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud ended it all, in blood. Thousands were slaughtered in what became known as the Auspicious Incident. The core was purged, its name erased from military doctrine. No formal manual remains. No Janissary school was preserved. What we have are outsider descriptions, imperial decrees, and stunned battlefield accounts. The force that once defined Ottoman might was made to disappear, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. The Janissaries were the first modern standing infantry, created from nothing, bound by ideology rather than inheritance, and when they no longer served power, they became a threat to it. What does it mean to build soldiers without a past? What happens when the perfect servant begins to question the master? In the shadow of empire, the Janissaries rose like stone sentinels, constructed, disciplined, and unleashed, then just as precisely dismantled. Their march ended not in defeat, but in silence. Because sometimes the most dangerous loyalty is the kind that cannot be controlled. What if the last to fall were the most forgotten? October 14th, 1066. A hill near Hastings. Mist draped the fields as two armies stared across rising ground. On one side, Norman cavalry massed for charge after charge. On the other, a wall of steel and will, unmoving. At the center stood the housecarls, the elite guard of King Harold Godwinson. They were not knights. They were not levied peasants. They were professional soldiers, full-time warriors in an age where most men fought only when the seasons allowed. Born from Scandinavian martial tradition, the housecarls were built for endurance, for discipline, for last stands. They lived with the king, traveled with him, protected him in palace and on field. Their loyalty was not to land or lord, but to the crown itself, and their weapon was the Danish axe, over 5 feet in length, over 6 pounds of forged steel, capable of splitting mail, shield, or bone. But they didn't swing wildly. They struck with timing, calculated arcs that disrupted cavalry, broke formations, and targeted horses mid-gallop. In shield wall formations, the housecarls were terrifying. Holding tight ranks while wielding two-handed weapons required constant drilling, precision under pressure, trust without question. At Hastings, they held the line against repeated cavalry assaults. Norman charges slammed against them and fell back, again and again, until rumor spread that King Harold had fallen. The wall wavered, but it didn't break, not at first. The last to fall were not the levied farmers. They were the housecarls, surrounding their king until breath and blood ran out. They died where they stood, and then they vanished from history. After William the Conqueror's victory, the feudal system took root in England. Power decentralized, loyalty fragmented. No more royal guard with centralized command. No more standing elite trained from youth. The housecarl model was buried, both literally and ideologically. No manuals, no training scrolls, no military academies preserved their methods. What we know comes from tapestries, poetry, and the stunned awe of chroniclers. They should have shaped centuries of military evolution. But they didn't. Why? Perhaps because they belonged to a world already fading. A world where loyalty was a full-time occupation, and warfare was not yet professionalized, but personal. Or perhaps they were erased, deliberately, by a regime that feared any force so loyal to the old crown. What's certain is this: the housecarls were a glimpse of something the medieval world was not ready to sustain: a disciplined, centralized fighting force, built not on wealth or nobility, but on relentless cohesion. They stood like a wall, and when they fell, a model of professionalism fell with them. In their silence, we hear the sound of possibility lost, a future of standing armies, abandoned before it could begin. What if precision became a weapon long before modern war? In 1241, as European knights gathered near the Sajo River in Hungary, they expected the usual pattern: a scattered horde, wild and disorganized. What arrived instead was a pattern of movement that felt more like a storm system than an army. Cavalry in waves, circling, firing, splitting, reuniting. Not chaos, choreography. And from hundreds of yards away, death rained down. Arrows, loosed with perfect rhythm. Horses galloping at full speed, while riders fired with lethal accuracy. Before any sword met another, the European lines had begun to dissolve. These weren't raiders. They were the Mongol heavy cavalry archers, and they rewrote what it meant to wage war. At their core was an innovation in organization. The Mongol army was built on a decimal system: squads of 10, companies of 100, battalions of 1,000, orders relayed instantly through flags, horns, smoke signals, and mounted messengers. They functioned like a neural network, dispersed yet unified. Each rider wore hardened leather or lamella armor, light enough for speed, strong enough for survival. Their bows, crafted from horn, sinew, and wood, could fire with deadly precision over 300 yards. Riders trained to shoot from any position, front, side, or behind, while moving. No military in Europe was prepared. The Mongols feigned retreats over miles to lure enemies into traps. They split forces, encircled strongholds, used flaming corpses and psychological tactics to weaken resistance before ever drawing swords. And yet, for all this complexity, they left almost nothing behind. No detailed training manuals, no preserved war colleges, only whispers of a military code, the Yasa, said to be passed down orally, its content still debated. What we know comes mostly from their enemies: Chinese scribes, Persian historians, European chroniclers, each describing the same impossible precision, as if the battlefield itself bent to the Mongols' will. How did a nomadic people with no permanent cities, no central academies, and no fixed institutions engineer one of the most advanced military systems the world had ever seen? Some credit necessity, the harsh steppe breeding adaptation. Others point to genius leadership, Genghis Khan and his successors selecting for ability over birth. But the scale remains staggering. Multi-front invasions across thousands of miles. Armies coordinated over terrain no maps had charted. Victory after victory, not by chance, but by systemic domination. And then, fragmentation. By the late 14th century, the Mongol Empire dissolved, its tactics scattered. Some fragments lived on, in Ottoman formations, in Russian cavalry, but the cohesion, the symphony of war, that was never duplicated. Perhaps it couldn't be, because the Mongol war machine wasn't just a product of training or tools. It was a culture of movement, memory, and unrecorded mastery. They didn't teach war, they performed it. And then, like smoke on the steppe, they disappeared, leaving behind only scorched earth and questions. What might have changed if they had written it all down? Or did they understand something deeper? That some power, once recorded, becomes vulnerable, that the sharpest edge is silence. What if erasure was more deliberate than defeat? Across centuries, 10 military forces emerged, each one a mystery. They didn't simply win battles, they shifted paradigms. They challenged assumptions about loyalty, structure, and what it meant to wield power. They should not have existed. Not in their time, not with their technology, not within the politics that birthed them. And yet, they did. The Sacred Band of Thebes, warriors bonded by love, defeating the invincible. The Persian Immortals, an army that never seemed to die. Rome's Testudo, a formation as precise as machinery. The Hun Crossbow Corps, a mechanized army before the industrial age. The Varangian Guard, foreign protectors more loyal than natives. The Mamluks, slaves who became kings through discipline. The ninja of Iga and Koga, shadows trained in strategy. The Janissaries, indoctrinated into obedience until they became too strong. The housecarls, a professional guard, erased with a regime. The Mongol cavalry, synchronized speed beyond medieval comprehension. Each unit was built with care, discipline, and astonishing foresight. And each vanished without direct successors, no surviving blueprints, no living traditions, no true explanations. Instead, we are left with fragments. A battle account here, a burial site there, a training manual in code, enough to prove they existed, never enough to repeat what they knew. What binds these forces together is not geography, culture, or weaponry. It is disappearance, a pattern of silence. Again and again, we see the same trajectory. A force is born outside the norm. Efficient, loyal, sometimes unnervingly modern. It thrives. Then it vanishes, often not through defeat, but through suppression. We call it progress when tactics evolve over time. But what if some of the greatest advances in warfare, in human coordination, strategy, psychological insight, were not steps forward, but glimpses backward? Echoes of systems we once discovered, and then buried? Why? Perhaps they became threats to their own creators, too loyal, too independent, too difficult to control. Perhaps they revealed truths about power, that it doesn't always flow from kings or states, but from those willing to march in impossible synchrony. Perhaps it is safer for empires and governments to forget, and so they were forgotten, not by accident, but by design. In the end, it isn't the victories that unsettle us, it's the vanishing. The quiet decision, made somewhere, by someone, that this knowledge was too much. That loyalty, this deep, precision, this fine, memory this sharp, was better left in the dark. And so, across continents and centuries, we see not just the rise of strange forces. We see a map of erasures, a history rewritten, not by the victors, but by those afraid of what these victors made possible. What if forgotten armies still echo beneath our feet? In the quiet hills near Charania, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave, 300 skeletons buried in pairs, shoulder to shoulder, side by side. No plaques, no fanfare. But the pattern told the story. It was the Sacred Band. Centuries after their final stand, they still lay together, silent testimony to a structure that should not have existed but did. And this is where so many of these lost forces now reside, beneath our cities, fields, and stories. In walls whose construction defies era, in ruins that don't match the records, in tools misclassified as ceremonial because their real function would ask too many questions. Sometimes we find a training scroll, coded and brittle, a symbol carved into stone where it shouldn't be, a line in an old soldier's memoir, too precise to be coincidence. And yet, we don't follow the thread. Why? Because these forces don't fit the official timeline, because their existence hints at a different path, one where military advancement wasn't linear, but cyclical, one where knowledge flared briefly, and was then snuffed out by fear, by politics, by design. The ninja, the Janissaries, the Mamluks, the Hun crossbow corps, the Mongol cavalry, the immortals, each represents a different culture, a different structure, but all share one eerie similarity. Their stories are incomplete, not because of time, but because someone ensured they would be. There are no modern equivalents, no revived models. No nations today have risked recreating forces with such cohesion, loyalty, or isolation. Perhaps because they know or suspect what happens when a weapon becomes a will, when discipline becomes identity, when silence becomes power. And so the world builds armies differently now, with doctrine, bureaucracy, and oversight. But in the shadows of history, these anomalies remain. Not myths, not metaphors, but blueprints, forgotten by most, preserved by few, occasionally unearthed, only to be filed away again. Because the question isn't whether we could replicate them, it's whether we should, and whether, if we did, we could still control what we had made. The past does not sleep. It waits, and beneath the ruins and the silence, it listens for the sound of footsteps it once knew, marching in unison through the dust of memory. What if history's silence isn't absence, but intention? We end where we began, with a question. Why did these forces, so precise and powerful, disappear so completely? The Sacred Band, who fought for love. The Immortals, who never seemed to fall. The Testudo, a human machine. The Han crossbows, engineers of death before the machine age. The Varangians, strangers trusted more than kin. The Mamluks, slaves who reigned. The ninja, artists of invisibility. The Janissaries, forged in ideology. The housecarls, professional before professionalism. The Mongols, tacticians without blueprints. Each of them a moment of clarity in the fog of history, and then silence. It would be comforting to believe they simply faded with time, that tactics changed, that empires moved on. But the pattern says otherwise. Time alone does not erase memory this cleanly. It does not burn manuals, scatter records, bury names in unmarked graves. Something else did. Perhaps fear, perhaps control, perhaps the recognition that such precision, such unity, cannot be tolerated for long. Because when a force moves with absolute discipline, when it obeys no bribes, no politics, no tradition but its own, it begins to challenge not only the enemy, but the very structures that created it. That's what echoes in the stories of these 10 armies, not just their victories, but their unrepeatability. Each one seems to ask, what if human beings could become more, could fight as one mind, could devote themselves so fully that their loyalty couldn't be bought, broken, or bent? And what happens when those in power realize such loyalty no longer belongs to them? Maybe that's why they were erased. Because they worked, and because those who remembered them saw the danger in letting others remember too. Today, traces remain, in ruins, rituals, and rumors. A line of ancient script, a skeleton beside another, a tactic that reappears under a different name. Like ghosts, these forces still walk among our histories, not to haunt, but to remind that once, across time and empires, people created something greater than the sum of soldiers. And then, as if on cue, they disappeared. So the question is not whether they existed. They did. The question is, who decided we shouldn't remember them? And what else have we forgotten, simply because someone chose not to tell the rest of the story?